Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks. After breaking through the second area of the outer curtain walls, the walls became untenable for the Vraksian defenders and their new chaotic masters. The remainder of the curtain walls were largely abandoned, and the pockets of resistance that still remained would slowly but surely be swept up and destroyed by the Deathcore of Krieg. And the siege appeared to finally be all but over. One last, final challenge stood before the 88th, that being the main citadel at the heart of all of the Vraksian defences. But cut off from any further reinforcements, surrounded and hemmed into such a small geographical area, there was no longer any real chance that the mortal defenders of Vraks could launch any form of major counterattack or turn the tides of battle. The only true threat to the 88th and its third master, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, now appeared to be coming from a political alliance on the Imperium's own side. A coalition between the Adeptus Administratum, Munitorum Ecclesiarchi, and Ordo Hereticus wished to see the victory on Vraks downplayed as much as possible. Ideally, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex would squeak by but the closest of victories, and preferably only after another few years of grinding siege warfare. And their political manoeuvring had already robbed Lord Hector of a sizable portion of his army. Unfortunately for them, it had not stopped the 88 from breaching the curtain wall. Lord Hector must, however, have realized that he was now very much so on the clock. Victory may seem inevitable, and perhaps it was as well against the conventional enemy, but Lord Hector was still firmly of the belief that the enemy on Vraks was anything but conventional, and with the fight against demons in the second breach, his worst suspicions had been very clearly proven. Not, however, that the Ordo Hereticus or their allies within the Imperium would mind overmuch about this fact. They were still of the opinion that they were the only ones who could truly bring the war on Vraks to a successful close. And if that was not to be the case, then they were fully intent on making it the case. They could not act against Lord Hector immediately. They had used the cover of official action, of administratum business as usual, to take away parts of Lord Hector Rex's army. But it would be quite some time before that excuse would fly again. They may have established a powerful alliance within the High Lords of Terror, but the other High Lords would not stand idly by and see the lengthy and costly siege on Vraks be lost for nothing. They would have to tread a fine path between weakening Lord Hector enough to ensure his relative failure, whilst also ensuring that he could not fail utterly. Of course, they did not believe in the idea that demons would feature heavily within the siege. Lord Hector, however, knew otherwise, and so he would swiftly need to bring the war to an end, both to get in ahead of any further political attacks against him, and to end the war before Zufor and his allies in the Sanctified Warband could bring further allies to bear. That, however, like most things on Vraks, was easier said than done. The enemy may finally be holed up in his final strongpoint. A strongpoint that had taken the 88 18 years to finally reach. But that did not mean that the Vraksian defenders were done yet. The final citadel was filled to the brim with the materials of war. Weapons, ammunition, and men, all fanatically loyal to their new Dark Masters. And the defenders had had close to 2 decades to prepare their positions. The citadel was already a formidable defensive work, Massive bastion walls made from permacrete and studded with automated gun emplacements. Artillery batteries mounted both on the top and inside of the walls. The slopes leading up to the citadel were steep, near impassable except for a handful of tailback roads, covered by countless pillbox positions, anti-tank emplacements, traps, minefields, sniper positions, and of course every square inch of the approach was pre-sighted by the artillery batteries. And then of course there was the small matter of the citadel's void shield generator, which protected not only the walls but the internal areas of the citadel, allowing the enemy to move troops around undisturbed, regardless of how much heavy artillery the Death Corps brought up in an attempt to crack through it. It also meant that the main walls would not be breached. The only ways into the citadel was either from beneath, into the massive crypt-like structures beneath the citadel, or through one of the main gates. This was, however, not a proposition that the 88th was overly fond of. The gates were, unsurprisingly, the most heavily fortified structures in the entire citadel, and that was saying something. Ever since Vraks' founding, every successive generation and planetary governor had improved upon the defences of Vraks as a part of their gubernatorial duties. And due to the simple fact that the citadel was the oldest piece of fortification on Vraks, it had been improved upon and expanded upon more than any other fortification on the entire planet. And so any attempt at taking one of the three main gates, the Great Gate, the Cardinal Gate, or the Lower Gate, would all be met with exceptionally stiff resistance, and casualties would unavoidably be very high indeed. And high casualties was really the last thing that Lord Hector Rex could afford at this point in time, as any setback on his behalf would be taken as a sign of weakness by his political adversaries. Thusly, a single regiment was dedicated to begin the assault upon the citadel. If that regiment failed, then another one would be slotted into the line, and then another one, with successive waves assaulting the citadel one by one, whilst the other regiment's heavy fire support elements all rained continuous artillery fire down upon the citadel. The lucky formation to have first crack at the citadel was the 261st Regiment, but before that, an effort would be made to see if a direct assault could, possibly, be avoided. If the void shield generators could be overloaded through a continuous heavy artillery bombardment with the aid of the Imperial Navy, then the above-surface construction works, the main citadel, the observation towers, and most of the gun batteries could be destroyed piecemeal. It would take weeks at the very least, and probably months, even using every heavy gun in the 88th and the entire complement of Marauder heavy bombers of the Imperial Navy in system. But it would save the Death Corps oceans of blood. The vast underground structures stretching down from the citadel would still have to be cleared out manually, and a good 75% of the citadel was buried deep within the mountain itself. No matter how many guns and no matter how many bombers were deployed, this area would still have to be taken by infantry formations. But with the above-ground fortifications cleared out, the enemy's position would have been severely weakened. But of course, this was all working off the assumption that the void shield generators even could be overloaded. The series of void shield generators housed beneath the Vraxian citadel had been designed to protect even the outer curtain walls against orbital bombardment, to protect the orbital defense laser batteries for long enough for them to decimate any attacking fleet. And when all of those void shield generators were focused exclusively on defending the final citadel, it was difficult to determine just how powerful they could be, And this was despite the fact that Imperial planners had access to all of the plans for the Citadel. They knew how many void shield generators there were. They knew where their projectors were located. They knew their energy supplies and their capacity. And yet, no one had really ever tried to overload generators of this power purely with a ground and aerial-based bombardment. This was usually the purview of the Imperial Navy, and even then, a substantial Navy commitment would have to be given for there to be any real chance of cracking the shield bubble. And with the current political situation, such a commitment was simply not possible. And so it would have to be broken open by Imperial Navy bombing runs and heavy siege artillery. From a purely technical standpoint, it should be feasible. If every gun fired continuously, hammering explosive ordnance down upon the shields, then theoretically, the shields should eventually be overcome with the sheer weight of energy poured into them. Void shields in the 41st millennium function by shifting a portion of the energy that hits the shield into the immaterium. They essentially disintegrate the shell and the explosive force entirely, dispersing it across a vast area. Instead of simply detonating the explosive charge over, say, a meter of shields, it taps into the immaterium and dissipates that energy over 100 meters of immaterial space. But even then, each shield can only dissipate so much energy before the generators themselves begin overloading. At that point, the generator must either be shut down and allowed time to dissipate all of the stored up energy, or risk seeing the entire device explode. Unfortunately, precisely how many shells can be diffused by a void shield is not at all a precise science. Since we are dealing with the immaterium here, a void shield generator could dispose of 10,000 impacts, or it could stand strong against 50,000 without showing any real sign of weakening. And the biggest problem would be the numbers of void shields. Even if one of the banks could be overloaded, if the Citadel had two more, then they would have to be able to overload the second and the third shield before the first could be brought back online. And even then, only in the period it would take for the first shield to be brought back online would the artillery be able to bombard the Citadel itself, which of course had been constructed to withstand precisely this kind of bombardment. The walls would eventually crumble under the weight, but the occasional hit here and there, the occasional 5-minute break through the void shields, it would take years in such a case for the walls to fully be reduced. And that, of course, was not taking into consideration that the enemy might be so uncouth, so inconsiderate, as to attempt to repair the walls whilst the void shields were up. And so, when Lord Hector Rex asked his advisors if it was even possible, all they could really say was that, yes, it was possible, but whether or not it was feasible, that was an entirely different question. In the end, however, Lord Hector determined that an attempt would have to be made. He wished to avoid extreme casualties if at all possible, as it, as mentioned, would be used against him as a sign of weakness. And so the 88 was ordered to conduct a continuous long-term heavy shelling of the Citadel. Fortunately for Lord Hector Rex, one of his predecessors had already done a lot of work when it came to the planning department. Due to Lord Commander Julka's great push, the 88th already had some experience with carrying out a vast, overwhelming, long-term artillery barrage, and the experiences earned during that operation would now be used to their fullest effect. The preparations would take weeks, The experiences earned during the Great Push was that to keep so many guns firing for such an extended period of time, you needed more than just ammunition. You needed the men to constantly be cycled in and out of the various gun crews to keep them at peak performance. You needed to afford the crews time to rest while still continuing to fire the guns. But the guns could themselves only be fired so many times before they ran the risk of simply exploding through catastrophic malfunction. To avoid that, the guns had to regularly be taken off the line, repaired, refitted, and in many cases, many large items entirely replaced, like the barrel, the breech block, or aiming mechanisms. And whilst some of the maintenance procedures could be carried out fairly easily with limited tools, changing the barrel of a heavy howitzer, that's going to require a fair bit of specialist equipment, not to mention specially trained crews. Now you need to organise repair, refit, and redeployment workshops behind the front lines. The guns then have to be carried back to these workshops, where they have to be refitted by specialist crews, who also of course need to have their own brakes. In the meantime, whilst one gun is being brought off the line, another gun has to be brought onto the line to replace the one lost. This is a massive logistical ballet that takes quite a bit of experience and planning to get correctly. Luckily, due to the Great Push, the 88th now had a hell of a lot more in the way of experience as to how to do this properly, whilst minimising the strain both upon the guns and the crews. It was hoped that the experience and planning would allow the guns to continue to fire smoothly over the course of months, if necessary, and since nobody really knew how long it would take even just to breach the void shields and how much damage could be achieved every time the shields were brought down, it could very easily become necessary to do so. As for the Imperial Navy, they would be participating in the bombardment by using flights of Marauder bombers. Each bomber, now operating from bases on the surface, could fly multiple raids against the Citadel every day. And with each aircraft being able to carry over 2.5 tons of bombs in formations of dozens of bombers at a time, the Imperial Navy estimated that they would easily be able to drop 100 tons of ordnance onto the Vraxian Citadel every day indefinitely. The Navy also informed the Lord Inquisitor that that number could be dramatically increased for short periods of time. But at that point, the air crews and the mechanics would be exposed to extreme fatigue, as would the aircraft. The Marauder bomber is a solid workhorse of the Imperial Navy, relying upon tried and tested designs. It could easily be maintained, and whole swathes of the aircraft could be switched out at will. But just like the air crews, even the Marauder bomber has a limit. Flying upwards of half a dozen or more sorties every day, whilst constantly exposed to enemy anti-aircraft fire, put considerable strain both upon the airframe and the engines, and carrying out such high-intensity operations for any more than a week or so at the time would run the risk of seeing the entire wing grounded for emergency maintenance, or worse, rendered virtually inoperable due to losses and lack of spare parts. And that really was the clincher as well. With the 88th having been down-prioritised by the Adeptus Administratum and Munitorum, spare parts, replacement crews, replacement gun and aircraft were all starting to come at a real premium, and with the continued machinations of Lord Hector Rex's political enemies, it was not at all inconceivable that the 88th could simply bombard itself out of existence by being rendered incapable of replacing the wear and tear losses inflicted upon it. And of course, there was still the enemy to consider. Guns and aircraft wouldn't just be rendered inoperable due to lack of spare parts or accidents. They might very well be rendered inoperable by the attentions of the enemy's high-explosive ordnance as well. And so, the bombardment strategy was a bit of a gamble for Lord Hector Rex. He gambled that he would have enough support when the High Lords of Terra and in the Skara sector to continue to cover all of his basic needs. This was, in and of itself, a leap of faith, because he knew that the bombardment plan would also draw criticism from the ecclesiarchy. The ecclesiarchy, immediately upon having been informed of the plan by their various operatives, immediately launched a storm of complaints against Lord Hector Rex's leadership. They saw this as nothing more than a blatant attempt to get back at them for perceived intervention in his campaign, as he now proposed to level both the Basilica of St. Leonis and the rest of the Vraxian citadel. Such heresy, they argued, could simply not be tolerated. The Basilica would have to be taken intact and delivered back to the correct authorities within the ecclesiarchy. But this time, the bleating of the priesthood fell upon deaf ears. The military necessities of the campaign would take precedence before the ecclesiarchy's need to maintain their precious basilica. And even the Ordo Hereticus could not really come up with a convincing counter-argument to that idea. After all, after having been in heretical hands for 18 years, one could certainly question just how holy that basilica could possibly be any longer. And after weeks of preparations and a little bit of politicizing, the order was finally given to begin the bombardment. It would not be quite as spectacular as the Great Push, since the 88th had since been bereft of half of its independent artillery companies and an entire bombardment corps. If those troops had still all been available, it was entirely possible that maybe Lord Hector Rex's plan of simply levelling the citadel could have been achieved. But as it was, it took a week before the first break in the shield was detected. A week of continuous bombardment and Imperial Navy bombing raids, and it ended with only half an hour's opening. For 30 precious minutes, every gun in the 88th, light as well as heavy, opened up on the citadel, in desperation to cause as much actual, real damage to the structure as possible. And then, after 30 minutes and no more, the first of the Void Shield generators flickered back into life and began intercepting shells once again. And despite the relatively disappointing results, even after having had 10 to 15,000 guns hammering away at the relatively unprotected citadel for half an hour, it was, nevertheless, a good sign. It showed that, yes, the Void Shields could indeed be breached, at the very least for a limited period of time. And with continuous pressure, it was hoped that more and more of the Void Shield generators and the power banks might be blown out. They were, of course, all safe from even the heaviest of bombardments buried deep inside of the mountain, but due to the continuous strain placed upon the generators, those, just like the guns of the Imperial Guard, and just like the Marauders of the Imperial Navy, would eventually require repairs and maintenance. And for those repairs and maintenance to be carried out, certain shield banks would have to be taken offline, increasing the stress and load placed upon the others. And the simple fact that the Void Shield generators had been brought down, even for a limited period of time, once, was a clear indication that the strain was beginning to show. And the next time the shields failed, they did so after 6 days, and stayed down for 45 minutes. As long as the bombardment could be kept up at the current rate and intensity, then the next time the shields would fail a little bit quicker, and stay down for a little bit longer. And every time the shields were breached, it was an indication that yet further banks beneath the citadel had been overloaded or taken offline for emergency maintenance. Every gap was a sign of weakness, and every little hint of weakness grew more considerable the longer the bombardment ground on. This was the first bit of truly good news the Lord Inquisitor had received in quite some time, and the enemy had shown no real activity during the first month of the bombardment. Legio Volcanum was still known to be operating somewhere on Vraks, presumably within the citadel, as repeated scouting runs by Marauder scout aircraft and lightnings had not revealed the Titan's locations. And vehicles of that size were notoriously difficult to hide. The enemy had also made no attempts at sallying out from their defences, which was quite reasonable, as the citadel was under bombardment from 10 to 15,000 guns. Any attempt of the enemy to move out of that citadel would immediately draw the undivided attention of every last single one of those pieces. And the fate of any such attempt would be exceptionally predictable. There was still the occasional report of minor incursions and suspicious-looking accidents, but these too had grown less and less frequent. Of course, Lord Hector Rex would not be aware of this, but maybe, just maybe, this was a sign that the Alpha Legion was finally getting sick of this song and dance, and were preparing their very own speedy exit from the theatre. Meanwhile, as it was still quite some time left before the void shields had been worn down to the point where an infantry assault was made practical, the plans for said assault could be revisited. The earliest plans for an attack upon the citadel had been drawn up by Lord Commander Julke, presumably in the time when he was too busy ignoring the other operations that were a wee bit more pressing. Lord Commander Julke always had a certain fascination with the end of the campaign, without necessarily being overly interested in how to actually get there. Those plans had then been viewed and relayed by Marshal Arnim Kagori, who had added his own particular twist to the plans and revised them quite considerably. He had, amongst other things, added in an underground element to the operations. Rather than assaulting the fortifications head-on, costing the lives of uncountable Death Corps guardsmen, he instead planned vast underground mining operations to break into the undercroft of the citadel, and so take the place from the bottom up. Lord Hector Rex, however, decided to combine both plans with a bit of his own inspiration as well. He would use the infantry siege regiments of the 88th to hammer away at the three main gates. He would also use the engineering companies to attempt to mine into the undercroft, and he was also in the process of developing a third option, where his inquisitors, along with their operatives and agents, would lead their escorts of Red Hunter Astartes in a lightning strike towards one of the citadel's main gates. But this was still in the early planning stages, and so would be kept at bay for now. The overall general plan was that first, the artillery bombardment would be allowed to continue until the gaps in the shield's active periods were large enough to allow an infantry formation to assault the three gates. Then an entire regiment-sized formation would be launched against the three gates simultaneously, spreading whatever defenders were left as thinly as possible. If that regiment was destroyed, then another regiment would be sent in. The plan was reminiscent of Lord Commander Julke's original idea, which called for over 1 million guardsmen to continuously launch themselves at the fortifications in wave-style assaults. Since the citadel itself was located at the top of an extraordinarily steep ridgeline and mountain, only certain areas of it could be approached at any one time, and even fewer approaches could be covered by armoured support, which meant that the men of the 88th would have to wander straight into pre-prepared killing positions and simply gain metre by metre, purchasing it with the flesh and blood of Krieg, whilst only being able to receive limited long-range support from armour and artillery elements. The Titans would stand by outside of the main battle lines. They would not be sent in to directly support the assault, because the presence of Legio Volcanum was still not entirely accounted for. If, by some chance, the traitor Titan Legion had been able to disappear into the vast open areas of Vraks and were able to launch an assault upon the 88 from the rear or sides, or even from the area still occupied by the worshippers of Nurgle, that could be the beginning of a catastrophe for the 88. And after having run damn close to one after the offensive of the 30th Line Corps, Hector Rex was not interested in making another big gamble. He'd made it out of the first one, but the God Emperor's gracious smile can only last for so long. And after another full month of continuous bombardment, the Void Shield generators had been brought mostly offline. The Citadel was now open to bombardment and was being hammered relentlessly by all of the heavy guns. Unfortunately, reducing it totally would take far too much time. 2 months had already passed, and the Lord Inquisitor was growing impatient and worried about any future movements from his political enemies. It was time to act now, and so he would in part follow Lord Commander Julka's initial plan. But with one significant change. The leading regiment would be the 261st Siege Regiment, now under the command of Colonel Tyborg. The very same Tyborg that had led the assault upon Fort A453 and had in large part been responsible for the very first breakthrough of the very first Vraxian defensive line. Tyborg had been put in command of his regiment after all of his superior officers, one by one, had met an untimely demise on Vraks, and had their remains added to the regimental reliquary, now being carried around by Colonel Tyborg's command squad. He had been wounded another 4 times since taking command, but by some God Emperor-granted miracle, he was still alive, although considerably more mechanical than last time we saw him. And as the Colonel received his briefing from the Lord Inquisitor personally, he was assured that his siege regiment would be afforded all of the support that was available to offer. They would have the direct support of a bombardment corps. They would be able to call upon his heavy guns as needed and when needed. Additionally, the Colonel would also be allowed to plan their initial barrage. The 261st would also be augmented with all the Gorgon heavy assault transport it wanted. And the regiment would also be supported, although with limited effect, by armoured elements. The tanks would not be able to follow the regiment into the assault with any real efficiency, but they would be able to stand back at maximum range and engage individual targets of opportunity. And hopefully, should the 261st secure a breakthrough, the armoured elements could then stream in with further Gorgon reinforcements. Throughout the entirety of the briefing, Colonel Tyborg simply stood there and accepted the instructions that he were handed down and absorbed every last scrap of information the Lord Inquisitor had for him. Colonel Tyborg must have known that this mission, honourable as it was, and he must certainly have appreciated to some extent the fact that he was being singled out as a virtual hero of Vraks, but he must also have been painfully aware of the fact that this mission meant the almost certain eradication of his entire regiment. But death in the name of the God Emperor of mankind was all Colonel Tyborg had ever expected and had ever hoped for, and he knew that his men would not balk at the sacrifice placed in front of them. He would lead his men from the front as he had always done, and if it was their fate to lay down their lives in the name of the God Emperor on this day, then so be it. The 261st Siege Regiment would march into the assault with all of the paraphernalia of war, their finest standards, their best uniforms, and the officers carrying their ceremonial sabres and cuirasses. The 261st Regiment would march in lockstep right up to the Emperor's right-hand side, and take their place beside him as the honoured fallen. And for that assault, you'll have to wait until the next episode. This whole rhythm of one administrative and one actiony episode is one I've actually kind of grown quite fond of, and might continue onwards with as well in the next big lore series. But until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all once again very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.